December 7, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led his formation of 9 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters through the Hawaiian morning sky, each bearing a distinctive red fuselage stripe marking them as aircraft from the carrier Akagi. They flew high above 26 Aichi dive bombers, providing escort as the formation approached Pearl Harbor. Below them, American servicemen were about to experience their first encounter with a fighter aircraft that would redefine everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. At approximately 8 o'clock that morning, as the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept across Oahu, American pilots and ground crews caught fleeting glimpses of sleek, agile fighters unlike anything they had seen before. These were the Mitsubishi A6M Type Zero carrier fighters, aircraft that most Americans had never heard of, despite intelligence reports from China that had been circulating for months. Those reports described a fighter with near-mythical capabilities in speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb. Most American military analysts had dismissed these reports as impossible exaggerations. They were about to learn otherwise. The Zero that appeared over Pearl Harbor that December morning represented the culmination of Japanese naval aviation's most ambitious design requirements. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy had issued specifications that seemed impossible to meet. They wanted a fighter capable of speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, exceptional maneuverability that could outfly any opponent, extraordinary range for long-distance escort missions, and powerful armament including 2 20mm cannons. Most aviation experts worldwide considered such a combination aerodynamically impossible. Designer Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi had achieved the impossible by making radical compromises. They stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning a single bullet could turn them into an inferno. The airframe itself was built of an innovative extra super duralumin alloy that saved weight but provided minimal structural protection. The result was an aircraft that weighed just over 5,000 pounds when loaded, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than its American counterpart, the Grumman FF Wildcat. This extreme weight reduction, combined with an 840 horsepower Sake radial engine, gave the Zero performance that bordered on the supernatural. At Pearl Harbor, American pilots who managed to get airborne discovered the stark reality of facing the Zero. In combat, Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, both pilots from the 47th Pursuit Squadron, were among the handful of Americans who successfully engaged Japanese aircraft that morning. Welch and Taylor had been at an all-night poker game at Wheeler Field when the attack began. Still wearing their tuxedo trousers from the previous evening's party, they raced to Halewa Auxiliary Field, where their P-40B fighters were stationed. What followed was a desperate aerial battle that provided the first real combat data on the Zero's capabilities. Welch managed to get airborne just as Japanese fighters were strafing Halewa. He immediately engaged a Zero in a turning fight and discovered what would become a terrifying reality for American pilots throughout early 1942. The Japanese fighter could turn inside his P-40 with ease. It climbed faster, accelerated quicker in level flight, and seemed to dance through the sky while his own aircraft felt like a truck in comparison. Welch survived through a combination of skill, aggression, and the one advantage his P-40 had over the Zero, the ability to dive away at high speed. In a dive, the heavier American fighter could outrun the lightweight Japanese aircraft. Welch would shoot down 4 Japanese aircraft that day, including at least 1 Zero, by using hit-and-run tactics, attacking from superior altitude, firing a quick burst, then diving away before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could bring their superior turning ability to bear. But Welch and Taylor were exceptions. Most American pilots never got off the ground. The Japanese attack had specifically targeted airfields first, destroying American aircraft on the ground where they sat lined up wingtip to wingtip. At Wheeler Field, 58 fighters were destroyed or damaged. At Hickam Field, only 19 of 58 bombers survived. The few Americans who did manage to engage the attacking Japanese aircraft found themselves hopelessly outmatched. During the attack, 9 Zeros were shot down, but the losses highlighted rather than diminished the Zero's capabilities. American anti-aircraft gunners and the few pilots who got airborne learned that the Zero could absorb surprisingly little damage. A few well-placed machine gun rounds could bring one down, but hitting the incredibly agile fighter proved almost impossible. The Zero could turn so tightly that American pilots trying to track it in a turn would stall their own aircraft. It could climb away from pursuit with ease. It could outrun American fighters in level flight at most altitudes. Several Zeros were recovered from Pearl Harbor after the attack, providing American intelligence with their first close look at Japanese fighter technology. 9 wrecked A6M fighters were pulled from the harbor and surrounding areas. Army Lieutenant Charles Olson and Warrant Officer Paul Grossman were tasked with examining the wreckage. On December 10th, just 3 days after the attack, they submitted their preliminary report. Using the most current intelligence manual from July 1941, Olson correctly identified the aircraft as a Fighter Type 100, matching it to specifications that had come from attaché reports in China. But the wrecked airframes could tell them little about how the Zero actually flew, how it maneuvered, what its true performance envelope was. The critical question for American aviators was not what the Zero looked like, but how to survive against it. That question became increasingly urgent as the war spread across the Pacific. In the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, American forces encountered the Zero throughout the Pacific theater. In the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, over Wake Island, and across the vast expanses of the South Pacific, American pilots faced the harsh reality that they were flying obsolete aircraft against a technically superior opponent. Wake Island provided another early lesson in the Zero's capabilities. 4 Marine Corps F-4F Wildcats of VMF 211 defended the isolated atoll against repeated Japanese attacks in December 1941. The Marine pilots fought with desperate courage and even managed to sink a Japanese destroyer with their bombs. But in aerial combat against the Zeros, they were outclassed. The Wildcats were slower, less maneuverable, and their pilots quickly learned that engaging in turning dogfights with Zeros was suicidal. In San Diego, California, during the autumn of 1941, a young naval aviator named John S. Thach had been working on a solution to a problem that most Americans didn't yet know existed. Thach, who went by the nickname Jimmy, commanded Fighting Squadron 3. In the spring of 1941, he had received an intelligence report from China that described a new Japanese fighter with performance far superior to anything the US Navy had. The report detailed an aircraft with a climb rate of 5,000 feet per minute, exceptional maneuverability, and a small turning radius. Thach was deeply concerned. He knew that the F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's primary carrier fighter, would be outmatched in traditional dogfighting. So he spent his evenings at his kitchen table in Coronado, arranging matchsticks to represent aircraft, working out tactical solutions. Thach understood that if American pilots couldn't outturn the Zero, they needed tactics that didn't rely on turning performance. He developed what he called a beam defense position. It involved 2 aircraft flying line abreast at a distance equal to the Wildcat's turning radius. When a Zero attacked one aircraft, both Wildcats would turn toward each other, crossing paths. This forced the attacking Zero pilot into an impossible choice. If he continued pursuing his original target, he would fly directly into the gun sights of the second Wildcat. If he turned to engage the second Wildcat, he would give the first aircraft time to escape or counterattack. Thach tested the maneuver with his squadron, including with the future Medal of Honor winner Edward Butch O'Hare. Try as he might, O'Hare, one of the most skilled pilots in the Navy, couldn't set up a successful attack against 2 aircraft executing Thach's defensive weave. Every time he lined up a target, it would turn away and another Wildcat would be rushing at him head-on. The tactic worked perfectly in training, but Thach never got to test it in real combat during the early raids on Japanese bases in March 1942. The true test would come later, at a place called Midway. Meanwhile, American intelligence was desperate for more information about the Zero. The wrecked airframes from Pearl Harbor had provided some data, but what was really needed was an intact, flyable example. In February 1942, a Zero piloted by Hajime Toyoshima crashed on Melville Island in Australia after the bombing of Darwin. But the aircraft was heavily damaged, burned, and provided little useful information. Another Zero, flown by Yoshimitsu Maeda, crashed near Cape Rodney in New Guinea. A recovery team was dispatched, but they made a critical error. They cut off the wings to make the wreckage easier to transport, severing the wing spars in the process and rendering the aircraft unflyable. In China, an engineer named Gerhard Neumann was working on reconstructing a Zero from a partly intact example that had landed in Chinese territory, supplemented with salvaged pieces from other downed Zeros. But the work was slow, conditions were difficult, and the reconstructed aircraft wouldn't reach the United States for testing until much later. During the early months of 1942, American carrier pilots were learning hard lessons about the Zero in combat. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, US Navy Wildcats faced Zeros in the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. The engagement provided valuable combat data. Wildcat pilots discovered that while they couldn't turn with the Zero, they had advantages in other areas. The Wildcat was more rugged, able to absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. It had better firepower, with 650 caliber machine guns that, while prone to jamming early in the war, delivered devastating hits when they connected. And it could dive faster than the Zero, allowing pilots to escape unfavourable engagements. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach was at the Coral Sea, though his Fighting Squadron 3 was aboard the Yorktown, which saw less action than other carriers during that battle. But pilots like James Flatley, who commanded VF-42, were developing similar tactics independently. Flatley and Thach would later compare notes, refining the defensive weave into a standardized tactic. At Coral Sea, the kill ratio between Zeros and Wildcats was roughly 1.5 to 1 in favor of the Japanese. Not a disaster, but clear evidence that American pilots needed better tactics and better aircraft. The battle also provided American engineers and tacticians with detailed combat reports about how the Zero performed under actual combat conditions. Pilots reported that the Zero was astonishingly agile at low speeds, but seemed to suffer control problems at high speeds. Its ailerons became heavy and sluggish above 200 knots. This was crucial intelligence. It meant that in a high-speed dive, the Zero pilot would have difficulty rolling to track a target, giving American pilots a window of escape. Then came June 1942, and a series of events that would fundamentally change the air war in the Pacific. The first occurred on June 4th during the Battle of Midway. Thach's Fighting Squadron 3 was tasked with escorting torpedo bombers from the Yorktown to attack the Japanese carrier fleet. Thach had 6 Wildcats under his command. As they approached the Japanese fleet, they were bounced by 15 to 20 Zeros from the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. What followed was one of the most significant aerial engagements of the war. Ensign Edgar Bassett's Wildcat was hit almost immediately, slanted toward the water-trailing smoke and exploded. The remaining 5 Wildcats found themselves in a desperate fight for survival against overwhelmingly superior numbers of more maneuverable fighters. Thach's wingman, Ensign Robert Ram Dibb, called out over the radio that he had a Zero on his tail. Thach immediately implemented the defensive weave he had practiced so many times with matchsticks on his kitchen table. He called for Dibb to turn toward him. As the 2 Wildcats crossed paths, weaving back and forth, the pursuing Zeros found themselves unable to maintain pursuit. Every time a Zero pilot tried to line up on one Wildcat, he would find himself facing a head-on attack from the other. Thach personally shot down 2 Zeros using this tactic, and his squadron claimed 6 confirmed kills against the Japanese fighters. More importantly, despite being heavily outnumbered, most of Thach's pilots survived. The beam defense maneuver, soon to be dubbed the Thach Weave by James Flatley, had proven itself in the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. News of the tactic spread rapidly through the Navy's fighter squadrons. It gave American pilots hope that they could survive against the Zero, even flying inferior aircraft. But the real intelligence breakthrough came just days after the Battle of Midway, though it would take more than a month before its significance became clear. On June 4th, the same day as the pivotal carrier battle at Midway, Japanese forces were conducting a diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. The attack was meant to draw American forces away from Midway, and though it failed in that strategic objective, it would have profound consequences for the air war. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, a 19-year-old pilot from the carrier Rougeau, took off as part of a 3-plane section assigned to attack Dutch Harbor. Koga and his wingmen engaged American forces over the harbor and may have been among the pilots who shot down an American PBY Catalina patrol aircraft and then strafed the survivors in the water. During one of his attack runs, Koga's Zero took hits from ground fire. One round severed the oil return line from his engine. Trailing smoke and with his engine beginning to seize from lack of lubrication, Koga throttled back and turned northeast toward Akutan Island, which had been designated as an emergency landing site. a Japanese submarine waited offshore to pick up downed pilots. Koga surveyed the island and spotted what appeared to be a perfect emergency landing field, a broad, flat expanse of green grass. He lowered his landing gear and prepared for what should have been a routine forced landing. What Koga couldn't see from altitude was that the smooth green field was actually a bog. The tall grass concealed standing water and soft mud. As his wheels touched down, they immediately caught in the muck. The Zero flipped end over end, coming to rest upside down. Koga, trapped in the inverted cockpit, either drowned in the bog's water or died from a broken neck. His body remained in the wreck. Koga's wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Sugo Shikada, circled overhead. Standard Japanese doctrine required them to destroy any aircraft that fell into enemy hands. But they couldn't tell if Koga was alive or dead. Unable to bring themselves to strafe their comrade's aircraft while he might still be alive, they departed without firing. The crash site was out of sight of standard flight routes, invisible from ships, and remained undiscovered for more than a month. On July 10, 1942, a PBY Catalina piloted by Navy Lieutenant William Bill Thies was on patrol over the Aleutians. Thies had been flying by dead reckoning and had become lost in the notorious Aleutian weather. When he spotted the Shumagin Islands, he reoriented and began flying the most direct route back to Dutch Harbour, which took him over Akutan Island. Machinist mate Albert Knack, serving as the plane captain, spotted something unusual through a break in the clouds: the distinctive red roundels of Japanese insignia on wings. These brought the PBY down for a closer look. What they had found was a nearly intact Zero fighter, sitting inverted in the bog. The crew could hardly believe their luck. This was the intelligence prize of the war. 2 days later, on July 12th, a salvage team led by Lieutenant Robert Kermser landed on Akutan. They gave Koga a Christian burial on a nearby knoll and attempted to recover the aircraft, but lacked the heavy equipment needed to free it from the bog. On July 15th, a third team arrived with proper equipment. They carefully extracted the Zero from the mud and hauled it overland to a nearby barge without causing further damage. The aircraft was taken to Dutch Harbour, turned right side up, and cleaned. On August 1st, the Zero arrived in Seattle aboard the USS St. Mihiel. From there, it was transported to Naval Air Station North, island near San Diego. Navy technicians worked carefully to repair the aircraft. The damage was surprisingly minimal. They straightened the vertical stabilizer, rudder, wingtips, flaps, and canopy. The landing gear struts needed more extensive work. The three-blade propeller was dressed and reused. Throughout the restoration, the aircraft was kept under 24-hour military police guard to prevent souvenir hunters from damaging it. The entire time, the Zero bore its original Japanese markings, though once ready for flight testing, it would be repainted with American insignia. On September 20th, 1942, 2 months after its capture, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of Koga's Zero for its first American test flight. What he discovered in that flight and the 23 that followed over the next 25 days would fundamentally change American tactics in the Pacific. Sanders' report was clinical but devastating in its implications for Japanese air superiority. The very first flight exposed weaknesses that American pilots could exploit with proper tactics. The most immediately apparent weakness was that the Zero's ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots. This meant that rolling maneuvers at high speed were slow and required tremendous force on the control stick. The Zero also rolled much more easily to the left than to the right. This asymmetry gave American pilots a critical tactical advantage. If pursued by a Zero, an American pilot should roll to the right. The Zero pilot, trying to follow, would find his aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. Even more significant was the Zero's carburetor design. The engine cut out under negative acceleration, under negative G-forces. This was because the Zero used a float-type carburetor that couldn't handle inverted or negative G-flight. American fighters used fuel injection or pressure carburetors that worked under any flight condition. This meant that an American pilot being pursued by a Zero had a perfect escape maneuver. Go into a vertical power dive, pushing the stick forward to create negative G-forces. The pursuing Zero's engine would cough and die, forced to pull up while the American aircraft accelerated away. Sanders and subsequent test pilots, including Lieutenant Melvin Boogie Hoffman, conducted extensive dogfighting tests, pitting the captured Zero against current American fighters. They documented every aspect of the aircraft's performance, its extraordinary turning ability, its impressive climb rate at low to medium altitudes, its excellent range, but also its weaknesses, the lack of armour, the unprotected fuel tanks that could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball from a single incendiary round, the light construction that meant the airframe couldn't absorb punishment, the heavy, sluggish controls at high speed, the engine failures under negative G, the relatively poor dive performance. All of this information was compiled into detailed intelligence reports and distributed to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific. American pilots were given specific tactical guidance: never engage in slow-speed turning fights with the Zero, use superior dive performance to escape or set up attacks, attack from high altitude, diving through the Japanese formation, firing and continuing the dive away, use the Thach Weave when forced into defensive combat. If pursued, roll right and dive with negative G-forces to cause the Zero's engine to quit. The impact was immediate and dramatic. At Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942, just as the intelligence from the captured Zero was being disseminated, Marine Corps and Navy pilots flying Wildcats implemented these tactics with increasing success. The Marines based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal developed a system where coast watchers on outlying islands would radio warnings of incoming Japanese air raids. This gave the American fighters time to climb to altitude before the Japanese arrived. When the Zero formations appeared, the Americans would already be positioned above them, ready to dive through in slashing attacks that gave the Japanese fighters no chance to use their superior turning ability. The kill ratio began to shift. In the early carrier battles of 1942, Zeros had enjoyed roughly a 3-2 advantage over Wildcats. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, that ratio had reversed. Wildcat pilots were consistently downing more Zeros than they lost. By war's end, the Wildcat would achieve a kill ratio of nearly 7-1 against Japanese aircraft, an astonishing turnaround from the dark days after Pearl Harbor. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh described how he used the intelligence from the captured Zero to survive and achieve 17 aerial victories. In one engagement, with a Zero on his tail, Walsh executed a split-S maneuver, rolling inverted and pulling through into a dive. With the Zero following, Walsh pushed the stick forward, creating negative G-forces. He wanted at least 240 knots, preferably 260. Then, as prescribed, he rolled hard right. Tracers from the Zero zinged past his aircraft's belly as the Japanese pilot tried to track him, but the Zero rolled slowly to the right. By the time the Japanese pilot could bring his guns to bear, Walsh had accelerated out of range. If Walsh hadn't known which way to turn, if he hadn't known about the Zero's asymmetric roll rate, he would likely have rolled left, directly into the Zero's line of fire. The intelligence from Koga's Zero saved his life. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, American industry began producing fighters specifically designed to counter the Zero's known characteristics. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which would become the dominant American carrier fighter of the war, incorporated lessons learned from both combat reports and from testing the captured Zero. The Hellcat was powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800, double Wasp engine, giving it speed and climb performance that matched or exceeded the Zero. It was heavily armed with 650 caliber machine guns. Most importantly, it was heavily armoured and built to absorb tremendous punishment. A popular myth claims that the Hellcat was designed based on examination of the Akuten Zero, but this isn't quite accurate. The Hellcat was already in prototype form when Koga's Zero was recovered. However, the detailed intelligence from testing the captured aircraft did influence the final development of the Hellcat, particularly in terms of tactics and pilot training. Butch O'Hare, the same pilot who had helped Thach test the Weave maneuver before the war, toured the Grumman aircraft factory in April 1942 and spoke with engineers about the Zero's characteristics based on his combat experience at Coral Sea. Based on these discussions and on reports from pilots like Jimmy Thach and James Flatley, Grumman made critical refinements to the Hellcat design. The cockpit was mounted higher in the fuselage for better visibility. The forward fuselage sloped down to the engine cowling, giving the pilot an excellent view over the nose. Wide-set, hydraulically actuated landing gear made carrier operations easier. The aircraft was designed to be easy to maintain and capable of withstanding the rigours of carrier operations. When the Hellcat entered combat in August 1943, It immediately demonstrated its superiority over the Zero. Hellcat pilots were trained using all the intelligence gathered from the A6M Zero. They knew the Zero's weaknesses. They knew not to engage in slow-speed turning fights. They knew to use their aircraft's superior speed and dive performance. They knew about the Zero's sluggish ailerons at high speed and its engine problems under -G. The result was devastation for Japanese naval aviation. The Hellcat would achieve a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, the highest of any American fighter in the war. The chance-fought F-4U Corsair, another American fighter that entered service in 1943, also benefited from the intelligence gained from the captured Zero. With a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour and excellent high-altitude performance, the Corsair could engage Zeros on entirely favourable terms, attacking from above at high speed, then using its superior power to zoom back to altitude for another attack. By mid-1943, American pilots throughout the Pacific Theatre had internalized the lessons learned from that inverted Zero in the Aleutian Bog. The aircraft that had seemed invincible in December 1941 was now a known quantity, an opponent whose strengths could be avoided and whose weaknesses could be ruthlessly exploited. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring pilots, later wrote about facing American pilots in 1943 compared to early 1942. The difference was stark. In the early days, American pilots would try to turn with Zeros, playing to the Japanese aircraft's strengths. By mid-1943, American pilots refused to engage in turning fights. They attacked from altitude, fired devastating bursts from their heavy machine guns, and sped away before Japanese pilots could react. Sakai described watching Zeros being shot out of the sky by American fighters that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The A6M Zero itself continued to provide intelligence throughout the war. After the initial test flights, it was displayed at Washington National Airport as a war prize. In 1944, it was recalled to North Island to be used as a training aircraft for rookie pilots heading to the Pacific. They could fly against an actual Zero, learning its capabilities and limitations firsthand. The captured aircraft's service ended in February 1945 in a training accident. While taxiing for takeoff, a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control and rammed into the Zero. The Helldiver's propeller sliced the Zero into pieces, destroying it beyond repair. From the wreckage, flight instructor William Leonard salvaged several gauges, which he later donated to the National Museum of the United States Navy. Small pieces of the aircraft are now held by the Alaska Heritage Museum and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. But the A6M Zero's legacy extended far beyond its physical remains. The intelligence gained from that aircraft, and the tactical innovations developed by men like Jimmy Thach, transformed American fighter operations in the Pacific. In the 26 months between Pearl Harbor and the end of 1943, American naval aviators went from flying inferior aircraft with inadequate tactics to dominating the skies over the Pacific with superior machines and battle-tested tactics. Some historians have debated the degree to which the A6M Zero influenced the outcome of the air war. They point out that Thach had developed the Weave before Pearl Harbor, based on intelligence reports from China. They note that combat experience at Coral Sea and Midway had already revealed some of the Zero's weaknesses. They emphasize that the Hellcat was already under development when Koga's aircraft was captured. All of this is true, but it misses the larger point. The A6M Zero provided something that intelligence reports and combat debriefs could never offer. It gave American test pilots the opportunity to actually fly the enemy's primary weapon, to feel how it handled, to discover not just that the ailerons were heavy at high speed, but exactly how heavy and exactly how much force was required, to experience firsthand how the engine quit under -G, to measure precisely how it performed in climbs, dives and turns. This detailed, hands-on knowledge allowed American tacticians to develop incredibly specific counter-tactics. Not just general guidance like don't turn with Zeros, but precise instructions. Roll right, not left. Use -G to kill the engine. Attack at speeds above 200 knots where your ailerons work, and theirs don't. Most importantly, the intelligence from the A6M Zero gave American pilots confidence. In December 1941, the Zero had seemed like an invincible superweapon. By late 1942, American pilots knew it was simply an aircraft, one with exploitable weaknesses. This psychological transformation was perhaps as important as any tactical advantage. Marine ace Joe Foss, commander of the famous Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal, had told his pilots with grim humour that if you find yourself alone and see a Zero at the same altitude as you, consider yourself outnumbered and go home. By mid-1943, that defensive mentality had completely reversed. American pilots actively sought out combat with Zeros, confident in their aircraft and their tactics. The transformation extended beyond just fighter versus fighter combat. American bomber crews flying B-17s and B-24s on long-range strikes benefited from the improved fighter escorts. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin-engine design and heavy armament, used intelligence about the Zero's high-speed handling problems to develop effective bomber escort tactics. The steady attrition of experienced Japanese pilots, combined with the increasing superiority of American fighters, meant that by 1944, Japanese air power was a shadow of what it had been in early 1942. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American fighters slaughtered Japanese carrier aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for minimal American losses. The Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies for the first year of the war, had become little more than target practice. It's worth noting that the Zero itself wasn't a bad aircraft. For its designed mission in 1940, it was brilliant. Long-range, highly maneuverable, well-armed for its time. The problem was that it couldn't evolve. Japanese industry lacked the resources to develop and mass-produce an adequate replacement. Attempts to upgrade the Zero with more powerful engines and heavier armament only made it heavier and less maneuverable without significantly improving its survivability. Meanwhile, American industry was producing fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair by the thousands, each one superior to the Zero in almost every measurable way, except low-speed turning ability. And American pilots, trained using intelligence from the Akutan Zero and from hundreds of combat reports, knew not to engage where the Zero was strong. The final statistics tell the story. In 1942, during the battles of Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal, the kill ratio between Zeros and American fighters was roughly even, sometimes favouring the Japanese. By 1943, American fighters were consistently achieving 3-to-1 or better kill ratios. By 1944 and 1945, the ratio had climbed to 10-to-1 or higher in many engagements. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Men who had entered the war as part of what they believed was an invincible elite found themselves hunted by ever-improving American aircraft flown by increasingly experienced pilots. Japanese pilot training programs deteriorated as the war progressed. Fuel shortages meant less training time. Experienced instructors were kept at the front until they were killed rather than rotated back to train new pilots. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were entering combat with less than 100 hours of total flight time, while their American opponents often had 400 hours or more, including extensive gunnery and tactics training. Tadayoshi Koga, the young pilot whose death gave the Americans their greatest intelligence prize of the Pacific War, was buried initially on Akutan Island by the American recovery team. In 1947, his body was exhumed by an American Graves Registration Service team, who were unaware of his identity, and reburied on Adak Island further down the Aleutian chain. His body was eventually repatriated to Japan in 1953, where he is memorialized at Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo, among other wartime aviators. Koga could not have known that his forced landing would become one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. His attempt to preserve his aircraft and his own life by landing with gear down rather than belly landing gave the Americans an intact example of Japan's most important fighter. That single aircraft recovered from an Aleutian bog and restored to flying condition by Navy technicians, helped transform the air war in the Pacific. The lessons learned from Koga's Zero, combined with the tactical genius of men like Jimmy Thach, the industrial might of American aircraft production, and the courage of thousands of American pilots, turned the tide of aerial combat in the Pacific. The fighter that had seemed invincible over Pearl Harbor had been defeated not through a single innovation, but through a combination of intelligence, tactics, training, and technology. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the A6M Zero had gone from a symbol of Japanese air superiority to a reminder of what happens when tactical advantages cannot be sustained against an opponent with superior resources and the ability to adapt. The Americans who first encountered the Zero over Pearl Harbor had faced an aircraft that seemed almost supernatural in its capabilities. 3.5 years later, American pilots had so completely mastered the Zero's weaknesses that it had become one of the most consistently defeated aircraft in the sky. The story of the Zero's rise and fall is ultimately a story about the nature of warfare itself. Superior technology provides an advantage, sometimes a decisive one, but that advantage is never permanent. Intelligence, tactics, training, and industrial capacity can overcome initial technical inferiority. The Americans learned the Zero's secrets not through a single brilliant insight, but through painstaking intelligence gathering, brutal combat experience, and the good fortune of recovering Koga's intact aircraft from that Aleutian bog. They then applied those lessons with the methodical efficiency that would characterize American operations throughout the Pacific War. From the first terrifying encounters over Pearl Harbor to the Turkey shoots of 1944, the confrontation between American pilots and the A6M Zero demonstrates how wars are won not just by weapons, but by the ability to learn, adapt, and overcome. The matchsticks on Jimmy Thatcher's kitchen table, the oil-soaked bog on Akutan Island, and the test flights by Eddie Sanders all played their part in transforming American fighter tactics from desperate survival to dominant superiority. Today, a handful of restored Zeros fly at air shows, beautiful and graceful reminders of a remarkable aircraft. But their grace in the air cannot erase the historical reality. The Zero was defeated by men who learned its secrets and exploited its weaknesses. And chief among those secrets was the one discovered when a young American test pilot climbed into the cockpit of Tadayoshi Koga's captured fighter and learned, for the first time, exactly what American pilots were up against and exactly how to win. The defeat of the Zero wasn't just a story of one captured aircraft or one tactical innovation. It was a systematic dismantling of Japanese air power that involved dozens of smaller revelations, hundreds of tactical refinements, and thousands of individual combat encounters where American pilots learned and applied the lessons that would eventually overwhelm their opponents. By early 1944, the intelligence gathered from the Akutan Zero had been supplemented by examination of dozens of other captured or downed Zero variants. Each new model that fell into American hands was thoroughly examined. Engineers discovered that later variants of the Zero, designated A6M3 and A6M5, attempted to address some of the original's weaknesses, but often created new problems. The A6M3, introduced in late 1942, featured clipped wingtips to improve roll rate at high speed. This helped somewhat, but the fundamental problem remained. The Zero was still too lightly built, still lacked armor protection, and still used the same basic airframe that couldn't evolve to match the new generation of American fighters. American intelligence officers interviewed every pilot who had engaged Zeros, compiling massive databases of combat reports. These reports revealed patterns that individual pilots might not notice. For instance, analysis showed that Zeros typically attacked in shallow high-side runs, diving from slightly above and to the side rather than in pure vertical dives. This was because the Zero's engine, with its float carburetor, would cut out in a steep dive. Japanese pilots had learned to work around this limitation, but knowing about it gave American pilots an advantage. If you saw Zeros diving on you from a steep angle, they were likely committed to that attack run, and couldn't easily pull out and reposition. The combat reports also revealed that Zero pilots in 1944 and 1945 were dramatically less skilled than those in 1942. The original cadre of Japanese naval aviators had been among the most highly trained pilots in the world. They had trained for years before the war began, many had combat experience in China, and they executed tactics with precision and discipline. But by 1944, most of those elite pilots were dead. The American War of Attrition had systematically killed Japan's best aviators. Saburo Sakai survived the war partly because he spent a significant portion of it as an instructor in Japan after being badly wounded in 1942. Most of his contemporaries weren't so fortunate. Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, credited with over 80 victories and considered by some to be the most skilled fighter pilot of the war, survived countless aerial combats only to be killed as a passenger in a transport aircraft shot down by American fighters in October 1940. The loss of experienced pilots wasn't just a matter of numbers. It represented the loss of institutional knowledge. In the American system, successful pilots were rotated home to share their experiences with new pilots. Men like Jimmy Thach, Joe Foss, and Butch O'Hare became instructors, passing their hard-won tactical knowledge to the next generation. Japan, facing manpower shortages and desperate to maintain fighter strength at the front, kept its pilots in combat until they died. This meant that tactical lessons weren't disseminated effectively. A Japanese pilot might develop a technique to counter the Thach Weave, but if he died before passing that knowledge along, it died with him. American pilot training programs in 1944 were producing aviators with 400 to 500 hours of flight time before they entered combat. They practiced gunnery against towed targets for dozens of hours. They flew simulated combat missions against instructors who knew all the Japanese tactics. They studied gun camera footage from actual combat. They even flew against the few captured Japanese aircraft that had been brought back to the United States for evaluation. By contrast, Japanese pilot training had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant that trainee pilots in 1945 might have as little as 40 hours total flight time before being sent to the front. Some never practiced gunnery with live ammunition. The difference in pilot quality became absurdly lopsided. An American pilot entering combat in 1945 was better trained than a Japanese squadron commander. This manifested in combat in stark ways. American pilots reported engaging Japanese formations that failed to execute basic defensive maneuvers. Zero pilots would fly in rigid formations that made them easy targets. When bounced, they would scatter rather than executing coordinated defensive tactics. Individual Japanese pilots would commit to head-on attacks that any trained pilot would know were suicidal against the concentrated firepower of aircraft like the Hellcat or Corsair. The psychological dimension of the air war had completely reversed. In early 1942, American pilots approached combat with Zeros with trepidation. They knew they were outmatched and fought defensively, trying to survive rather than dominate. By late 1944, American pilots were so confident that some complained about the lack of challenging opponents. Medal of Honor recipient David McCampbell, who had become the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, described a mission in October 1944 where he and his wingman engaged a formation of over 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft in that single mission. His wingman shot down 6, and they didn't suffer a scratch. The engagement lasted over 90 minutes, and at one point McCampbell ran completely out of ammunition, but continued making fake attack runs to keep Japanese fighters away from American bombers. The Japanese pilots, inexperienced and poorly trained, didn't realize his guns were empty. This would have been inconceivable in 1942. The tactical innovations that began with Thach's Weave evolved into increasingly sophisticated fighter tactics. The concept of mutual support, where fighters operated in pairs or quartets with each aircraft covering the others, became standard throughout American fighter aviation. The Finger 4 formation, where 4 aircraft flew in a pattern similar to the fingertips of an outstretched hand, gave maximum flexibility and mutual support. Each pilot had a wingman whose sole job was to protect him. The lead pair would engage targets while the second pair covered them, watching for threats. This formation, combined with the superior performance of American fighters and better trained pilots, created an almost insurmountable advantage. Zero pilots, often flying alone or in loose formations due to lack of training and fuel, found themselves facing coordinated teams of American fighters who worked together with practiced precision. The intelligence from the A6M Zero also influenced ground attack tactics. American pilots discovered that the Zero's lack of armor meant that even 50 caliber machine gun fire could bring one down with relative ease. During ground attack missions, where American fighters strafed Japanese airfields, the parked Zeros were extremely vulnerable. A single strafing run could destroy multiple aircraft. Japanese attempts to disperse and camouflage their aircraft had limited success because American intelligence, including code breaking and aerial reconnaissance, usually knew where Japanese airfields were located. Fighter sweeps, where American fighters flew ahead of bomber formations specifically to engage and destroy Japanese fighters before they could intercept the bombers, became devastatingly effective. American pilots would arrive over Japanese airfields just as Zeros were taking off, catching them at their most vulnerable. A Zero at low altitude just after takeoff with gear down and flaps extended was nearly helpless against a diving Hellcat or Corsair. The captured Zero intelligence had revealed exactly how long it took a Zero to retract its gear and accelerate to combat speed. American pilots used this knowledge to time their attacks perfectly. One particularly effective tactic developed from the Zero intelligence was the speed run. American pilots would approach a target area at high altitude and high speed. If Zeros rose to intercept, the Americans would simply push their throttles forward and fly past the Japanese fighters. The Zeros couldn't catch up. Once the Americans had crossed the target area, they would orbit at high speed, forcing the Zeros to either pursue, which would take them away from the bombers they were supposed to protect, or ignore the fighters and focus on the bombers, which would allow the American fighters to attack from behind with impunity. This tactic exploited the Zero's poor high-speed performance. At speeds above 300 miles per hour, which American fighters could maintain easily, the Zero's controls became sluggish, and its engine, optimized for low to medium speed combat, couldn't produce enough power to keep up. Japanese pilots trying to pursue fast-moving American fighters would fall further and further behind, burning precious fuel while the Americans easily stayed out of range. The night fighter variant of the A6M Zero intelligence came from a different source. In 1943, the Japanese introduced a night fighter variant of the Zero, equipped with primitive air intercept radar. One of these aircraft was forced down in 1944 and recovered by Australian forces. Examination revealed that the radar installation was crude but functional. More importantly, it revealed that the additional weight of the radar equipment and the operator further degraded the Zero's already marginal performance. This intelligence led to American night fighter tactics that emphasized speed over maneuverability. American night fighters like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, night fighter variant and the F-4U Corsair night fighter simply flew faster than the Japanese could effectively engage. The thermal signature of American aircraft engines, running at higher power settings, was actually easier for Japanese radar to detect. But it didn't matter. By the time a Japanese night fighter could maneuver into position, the American aircraft had already attacked and sped away. The intelligence gathered from captured Zeros extended to maintenance and logistics. American engineers discovered that the Zero required extensive maintenance to keep flying. The lightweight engine had tight tolerances that required skilled mechanics and good quality lubricants. As the war progressed and Japan's industrial capacity declined, the quality of replacement parts and lubricants deteriorated. This meant that Zeros in 1944 were less reliable than those in 1942, even when they were newer aircraft. American intelligence officers interviewing captured Japanese mechanics learned that many Zeros in late war service were flying with degraded engines that couldn't produce their rated horsepower. Fuel quality had also declined significantly. The high-octane aviation fuel that the Zero's Sakai engine was designed to use became increasingly scarce. Japanese forces often had to use lower-grade fuel that reduced engine performance and increased the risk of detonation and engine failure. American pilots reported encountering Zeros that seemed sluggish and slow. Often these weren't older models, but newer aircraft hampered by fuel and maintenance problems. The contrast with American logistics was stark. American carriers and forward airfields had abundant supplies of high-quality fuel, lubricants and spare parts. If an engine was running rough, it was replaced. If an aircraft was damaged, it was repaired properly or scrapped and replaced with a new one. American mechanics had detailed technical manuals for every system. They had specialized tools. They had replacement parts that were manufactured to exacting standards and were completely interchangeable. A pilot flying a Hellcat in 1945 could be confident that his aircraft was in perfect mechanical condition. His engine would produce full-rated power. His guns would function reliably. His radios would work. His gun sight would be properly calibrated. This reliability gap was another form of superiority that stemmed partly from the intelligence gathered through examination of captured aircraft. American engineers could see how Japanese aircraft were designed and manufactured, could identify weak points and failure modes, and could ensure that American aircraft didn't suffer from similar problems. The psychological warfare dimension of the air war also evolved based on intelligence about the Zero. American intelligence officers learned through interrogations of captured Japanese pilots that many had been told the Zero was invincible, a fighter that American aircraft couldn't match. When these pilots encountered the reality of air combat in 1944, where American fighters consistently destroyed Zeros with ease, the psychological impact was devastating. Some captured Japanese pilots exhibited symptoms of deep psychological trauma. They had been taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, They had been told their aircraft were superior. The collision between this indoctrination and the reality of overwhelming American superiority broke some of them completely. American interrogators, using intelligence gathered from earlier prisoners and from captured documents, learned how to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities to gather more information. The intelligence cycle became self-reinforcing. Better intelligence led to better tactics. Better tactics led to more victories. More victories led to more captured aircraft and prisoners. More captured aircraft and prisoners led to better intelligence. By 1945, American intelligence officers had such detailed knowledge of Japanese aircraft, tactics, and organization that they could often predict Japanese movements and responses with remarkable accuracy. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 represented a tactical shift born of desperation. Japanese commanders, recognizing that their pilots couldn't match American fighters in conventional combat, began using aircraft as guided missiles. The Zero, with its long range and adequate speed, became one of the primary kamikaze aircraft. But even here, intelligence made a difference. American combat air patrol tactics evolved to intercept kamikaze attacks far from their targets. Navy fighter directors, using radar and radio communications, would vector fighters to intercept incoming raids while they were still dozens of miles away. The Hellcats and Corsairs would tear into the Japanese formations, shooting down attackers before they could reach the fleet. The intelligence from the A6M Zero had revealed that the Zero couldn't absorb much punishment. A few hits from .50 caliber machine guns were usually sufficient to bring one down. This meant that in anti-kamikaze operations, American pilots didn't need to completely destroy an aircraft, just damage it enough that it couldn't maintain controlled flight. Even a kamikaze with a dying engine couldn't make it to the target. The final air battles of the war, fought over Japan itself in 1945, demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority that had occurred since Pearl Harbor. American carrier task forces operated with near impunity off the Japanese coast. Zeros and other Japanese fighters that rose to defend their homeland were slaughtered. On one mission, in July 1945, American fighters from multiple carriers engaged Japanese defenders over Tokyo. The kill ratio exceeded 20-1 in favor of the Americans. Some American pilots returned from missions without having fired their guns because their squadron mates had already destroyed all the Japanese aircraft in the area before everyone had a chance to engage. The few experienced Japanese pilots who survived to war's end were flying obsolete aircraft, short on fuel, often without proper maintenance, against enemies who knew every weakness of their machines and every gap in their training. It was no longer warfare in any meaningful sense, it was execution. When Japan surrendered in September 1945, the remaining Zero fighters were mostly grounded due to fuel shortages. Those that could still fly were ordered to participate in what would have been the final defense of the home islands against the planned American invasion. Intelligence estimates suggested that thousands of aircraft, including Zeros, would have been used in kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. The atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war made the invasion unnecessary, but American planning documents show that intelligence officers had carefully analyzed how to counter the expected kamikaze onslaught. The tactics they proposed were based largely on lessons learned from examining the A6M Zero 4 years earlier. After the war, Allied technical intelligence teams fanned out across Japan, cataloguing and examining Japanese aircraft technology. They found warehouses full of Zero parts. They interviewed Japanese engineers and designers. They examined the manufacturing facilities where Zeros had been built. The picture that emerged was of an aircraft that had been brilliant for its time, but that couldn't evolve to meet changing requirements. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, was interviewed extensively by American intelligence officers. He explained the design choices that had created the Zero's unique combination of capabilities and vulnerabilities. He described the pressure from the Japanese Navy to create an aircraft that could meet impossible specifications. He talked about the compromises required to achieve long range and maneuverability. American engineers, listening to Horikoshi, recognized that they had made fundamentally different choices. American fighters were heavier, used more fuel, required more maintenance, and cost more to build. But they could be evolved. The basic Hellcat and Corsair designs could be upgraded with more powerful engines, better weapons, improved avionics, without fundamentally redesigning the aircraft. The Zero had been optimized to such an extreme that there was no room for growth. The captured Zeros that had been brought to the United States during the war became museum pieces. The A6M Zero, destroyed in the 1945 training accident, had pieces distributed to various museums, but other captured Zeros survived intact. These aircraft became prized exhibits, reminders of an enemy that had once seemed invincible. Today, a handful of airworthy Zeros exist, painstakingly restored and maintained by aviation museums and private collectors. When these aircraft fly at airshows, they attract enormous crowds. Spectators watch in awe as the graceful fighters perform, executing the tight turns and precise maneuvers that made them so feared in the early days of the war. But anyone who understands the history knows that the Zero's beauty masks its fundamental flaws. The same lightweight construction that makes it agile also makes it fragile. The same long range that made it effective in the vast Pacific also resulted in unprotected fuel tanks. The same emphasis on maneuverability that made it deadly in turning fights also left it vulnerable in high-speed combat. The intelligence coup of the A6M Zero remains one of the most significant in military history. A single intact aircraft captured by chance, examined thoroughly and tested extensively, provided information that helped reshape an entire theatre of war. The tactical innovations developed by Jimmy Thach and refined by countless other pilots gave American aviators the tools to survive and prevail against a technically superior opponent. The industrial might that produced Hellcats and Corsairs by the thousands gave them the weapons to dominate, but none of it would have mattered as much without the detailed intelligence that revealed exactly how to defeat the Zero. The veterans who fought this air war, both American and Japanese, are nearly all gone now. The pilots who first encountered Zeros over Pearl Harbor, who developed the tactics that would defeat them, who flew the missions that destroyed Japanese air power, have passed into history. But the lessons they learned remain relevant. Superior technology provides an advantage, but not victory. Victory requires intelligence to understand your enemy, tactics to exploit their weaknesses, training to execute those tactics effectively, and the industrial capacity to sustain operations. The Americans who faced the Zero learned all of these lessons, often at terrible cost. The story of how they learned the Zero's secrets and used that knowledge to transform defeat into victory remains one of the most remarkable intelligence and tactical success stories of modern warfare. From the matchsticks on a kitchen table, to the wreckage in an Aleutian bog, to the tactics that won the Pacific Air War, it's a testament to the power of human ingenuity, adaptability, and determination. The Zero that seemed invincible over Pearl Harbor had become obsolete by war's end, not because it had changed, but because the Americans had learned everything about it and developed the means to counter it completely. That knowledge, gained at such terrible cost in the early days of the war, purchased with the lives of pilots who flew against Zeros before anyone understood their weaknesses, ultimately helped win the war in the Pacific. The sky over the Pacific, once dominated by the graceful Zero fighters, belonged to America by war's end. And it all began with one crashed aircraft in an Aleutian bog and the determination to learn everything it could teach.